Okay, in this screencast, we're going to talk about cell reproduction. So what is cell reproduction? Can I explain it very fast? Well, yes, in a text. Someone had texted me, oh, can you explain cell division very fast? How they misspelled cell division. Sure! There's a cell, it grows, it gets bigger, divides into two cells, they separate, and we have cell reproduction. There it is. Very simple. Thanks, you're welcome. Okay, well, there's a little bit more to it than that, right? Because when the cell divides, it's got to make sure that it divides up all the chromosomes evenly. So there's this process called mitosis involved in there. Since we have 46 chromosomes, we have to make sure we divide them evenly and get the right amount in each daughter cell. So you can see here, you can't see the cell, right? Maybe here's the cell and here's the nucleus, right? And normally in the nucleus, you can't really see the DNA. It's unraveled. It exists in that state called chromatin. But before a cell can divide, that chromatin is going to form these thick threads called chromosomes. And then those chromosomes are going to line up sort of on an equator right there. And then they're going to move to opposite poles or regions. And we're going to end up with two daughter cells, each with their own set of DNA or chromosomes within the cell, and the nucleus what will reappear there. So this step that we see in this image here is this process of mitosis, which is an important step in the cell reproduction process. So first off, why do cells have to divide? What's the purpose of cell division? Well, if you're an amoeba, it's how you produce more amoebas. So if you're asexual, this is how you reproduce. So yeast cells, amoeba cells, bacterial cells, anything that's asexual, copies all their DNA, divides up the chromosomes, and forms two identical daughter cells. So that's one important function of cell division. Well, how about if you're a human? We're not asexual, we're sexual. But after that egg is fertilized by the sperm, it's got to grow and divide, right? You start as one fertilized egg, microscopic, and you end up as this large organism with trillions and trillions of cells. All those cells result from cell division, right? So growing and then developing. And again, developing is turning on different genes in different cells so they become skin cells, heart cells, nerve cells, right? So that growth and development process is due to this cell division process. A third thing, even though I've stopped growing, I'm not getting any bigger, I'll still skin my arm or break a bone or do things, damage tissue, where that tissue has to kind of grow back and repair itself. As long as it's not nerve tissue or muscle tissue, they can't divide, they can't regenerate. All the other cells in my body can. So tissue renewal, this is an image of bone cells that are dividing and starting to grow back after a bone is broken, right? Or a skin graft. If you've burned an area, they take some skin and move it, and then that skin grows back. If you skin your arm, the way it regenerates is through cell division. So this process of cell division is also called the cell cycle. The cell cycle is the life of a cell. The cell grows, reaches a certain stage, and then it divides. So the cell cycle can be broken down into two important parts, okay? The first one is that growth stage. That's called interphase. And again, the cell's going to spend most of its time in interphase, growing, producing proteins, secreting things, doing all the things it needs to do, maintaining homeostasis, etc., etc. Then it's going to reach a point in interphase where it needs to divide, and then the process is called mitosis, of dividing up the chromosomes. So mitosis followed by cytokinesis. Cytokinesis just means dividing the cytoplasm. After we've split up the chromosomes, we pinch off into two identical cells. Okay, so that process of dividing up the chromosomes we can break down into 4 steps. P stands for prophase, M stands for metaphase, A stands for anaphase, and T stands for telophase. And you're like, wait, whoa, that's a lot of words, a lot of vocabulary that I'm throwing at you right now. So let's try to get an easy way to remember the processes within the cell cycle. Okay, so here's our little friend, and he's peeing. You've probably seen pictures of him everywhere on the back of pickup trucks, right? He's peeing, but he's not peeing anywhere. He's peeing on a mat. So if you remember, I peed on the mat, you'll remember the stages of the cell cycle in the proper order. So what does that mean? I peed on the mat. Well, I stands for interphase. That's the growing and developing stage, right? P stands for prophase. M stands for metaphase. A stands for anaphase, and T stands for telophase. So now let's briefly go over what happens in each one of these stages. So we already said interphase is where cells grow and they kind of reach a certain size and they produce proteins and they do all the things they need to do. But here's a cell in interphase. You can see it's got the nucleus, right? You can't really see the chromosomes in there. They're unraveled. They're in that form we call chromatin, right? But you can see once the cell starts prophase, I can see that looks like the nucleus is getting bigger. It's actually kind of dissolving. And I can see the DNA is forming these thick threads called chromosomes. So chromosomes are forming in prophase. I can also see these two structures called centrioles. We talked about how animal cells have these things called centrioles that are involved in cell division back when we were talking about parts of the cell. Well, these centrioles are going to sort of anchor and they're going to take the cytoskeleton and start to build this structure called the spindle. Basically, these microtubules are going to build a scaffolding upon which the chromosomes are going to be moved. So that's prophase, the first stage. Metaphase, chromosomes are lining up in the middle. You can see here's our centrioles. You can see the spindle fibers are pretty well defined there. Everything's kind of getting set as we line up. And then in anaphase, this looks a lot like metaphase to me, but really what happens at anaphase is they start to get pulled away. So this is called early telophase, but you can see in anaphase and early telophase, the chromosomes are moving in opposite directions. Those are moving in there, those are moving there. And then within late telophase, you can see the chromosomes are starting to unravel. They're going to sort of unravel into that form of DNA called chromatin again. And you can't see it here, but the nucleus is going to start to reform around each set of chromosomes. You can see the cell. This is an animal cell, so it's pinched off and formed two identical cells with two identical sets of chromosomes. So that's mitosis. So let's look at each step in a little bit more detail, or at least a little more clearly. First, though, let's talk about chromosomes. When a chromosome has to divide, it's got to replicate. It's got to make a copy of itself. So we've got a chromosome here, and that chromosome is going to replicate. When it does, it's going to form two things called sister chromatids. It's basically two copies of the chromosome. So there's one copy, there's another copy. They're held together by a little belt called a centromere. So when we talk about chromosomes in mitosis, they exist in the first part of mitosis as sister chromatids, and they look like that. After they've been divided, they're back as single chromosomes. So just understand that when we see them as sister chromatids, it's because we have the chromosome and then its replicated copy, which are each going to end up in one cell. Okay, so here's prophase. Notice in prophase, the nucleus is starting to dissolve. The chromosomes are starting to become visible. We call them now chromosomes and not chromatin. And you can see here the centrioles, which are here and here, are starting to form. They're starting to build up these microtubules into this spindle formation. So pro means before, phase, this is the before phase, before the chromosomes have been sort of separated. And then metaphase, meta is the middle phase, and it's also when the chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell in what we call the metaphase plate. They're lining up in the middle of the cell, and then each of the sister chromatids is going to get attached to a part of the spindle fiber called the kinetochord, and these cords are basically going to pull them in opposite directions. So in metaphase, all the chromosomes are in the middle of the cell. This is what it looks like in a real cell. Notice they're all kind of bunched up in the middle. And here's the spindle and centrioles. So that's the metaphase state. And then in anaphase, you can see they are being pulled in opposite directions. Those chromosomes are getting pulled up there. Those are getting pulled down there. And then telophase is the end phase. And you can see that the membrane is pinching in, forming two cells. And you can see the nucleus is starting to reform around the sets of chromosomes there and there. And the chromosomes will unravel and form chromatin again, and this cell will end up with two identical cells when we're done with that. Okay, one difference between cell division or mitosis in plants versus animals is to remember that animal cells have a cell membrane. So cell membranes can just pinch in and form two identical cells. When they pinch, that's called cleavage. Cleavage is just a pinching in of flesh or of anything. You may have heard that term before. So this cleavage furrow is the pinching in within animal cells because they have a membrane. Well, plant cells have a cell wall. It's rigid. You can't just pinch it in. So they actually construct this thing. You can sort of see it here, but on this image it shows it. It's constructing this thing called a cell plate. So in a plant cell, because you have these rigid cell walls, you have to construct a cell plate between each of the new nuclei that are forming. So one difference between plants and animals, pinching in of the membrane versus construction of a cell plate. Okay, so in class, I'm going to have you look at a bunch of cells and try to identify the stage of the cell cycle that they're in. So if we look at this diagram, you can see most of the cells are in a stage like this where you see a clearly defined nucleus. That's obviously in interphase, right? I don't see any chromosomes. I see a nucleus. Everything's kind of looks like a normal cell when we looked at onion cells. These, by the way, are onion root cells. But if I look at this cell right here, I see that I've got some chromosomes over here and I've got some here. They look like two jellyfish moving away from each other, right? Well, those are two sets of chromosomes being pulled by the spindle fibers in opposite directions. So that being pulled in opposite directions is called anaphase, okay? So that's a cell that's in anaphase. If I look down here, I have a cell and can sort of see where the nucleus is, but the nucleus looks bigger. It's because the nucleus is actually sort of dissolving, and I see visible chromosomes in there. So this is obviously the first step of mitosis. It's called prophase, right? So prophase is where I see visible chromosomes, but I don't necessarily see them arranged in the center or being pulled away. Okay, if I look around, I see here I've got some chromosomes, but they all look like they're kind of bunched up in the middle, right? If we said this is sort of like the metaphase plate, they're all kind of getting lined up there. So I could say maybe this is a good example of a cell in metaphase. And then if I look down here, I see there are two sets of chromosomes. Kind of looks like this one in anaphase, but you can see the nucleus is reformed around them. And notice the chromosomes are a little harder to see. They're starting to unravel and form chromatin. So this might be an example of a cell that's in what we call telophase. So in the lab, we're actually going to look at a bunch of cells and try to determine the stage of the cell cycle they're in. So this was a quick introduction into the cell cycle and then some of the stages within the cell cycle called mitosis, right? Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And that's it for this screencast.